to Dante, and we'll go from there. Dante, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, General Cheney and American Security Project, for staying long on the issue of Caribbean energy security, resilience, climate change, and a lot of uncomfortable subjects, especially in a city like this one, when what we've had over the last 2 months are real stark reminders of our humanity and real stark reminders of the motto of this country, which is, out of many, we are one. Each one of the events that I'll describe in a moment, and then we'll really focus in on Puerto Rico, does not recognize party, does not recognize wealth, does not recognize where you live and how you live. So we have to recall the country now is facing disaster fatigue. Just on the heels of Hurricane Harvey and the largest rain event in recorded history in the United States, Hurricane Maria destroyed much of the Caribbean. There are islands in the Caribbean that are uninhabited by people for the first time in more than 300 years, the island of Barbuda. So this concept of climate change refugees is here and now. It's not something we have to wait for in a far-gone conclusion or in a far-off future. It's happening now. Then you had that same hurricane system devastate much of Florida, the entire state, in fact, parts of South Carolina and Georgia. And Irma was the most persistent and most powerful Atlantic hurricane ever recorded. So we need to stop discussing climate change and replace the word for the present, which is climate changed. And what are we going to then do about it as a country, not only for our citizens, 3.4 million of them on the island of Puerto Rico, but our neighbors. We have an obligation as a country with the type of military prowess, economic prowess, and entrepreneurial ingenuity that we could bring to bear on these issues to do much more than we're doing now. And so focusing in on Puerto Rico, where I'm from, and this, usually I sit here and I speak in the abstract, but today I will not, because not only are all of these things that I write about and trade about with my company coming home to roost, this time it's personal. So in 1989, Hurricane Hugo destroyed my house. I was 12, not to date myself. And from that point forward, it completely devastated my mother's ability to hold our household together, and I never lived with my family again. Had to grow up real fast. And I could only think back to a hurricane as devastating as Maria, a direct hit over the island of Puerto Rico, which was at once already vulnerable, and we'll talk about that for a few seconds, but it was also the staging ground for relief efforts in other Caribbean islands that had just suffered the consequences of Hurricane Irma. Puerto Rico was quite literally the center of relief efforts for our neighbors. And so we should take no comfort that our response as a country has been slow. And we're not here to criticize, we're here to call for action. And I think this rallying cry of Build Back Better really establishes what is the opportunity in Puerto Rico. So leading up to where we are now, 3.4 million American citizens facing up to 6 or 8 months in darkness, a complete humanitarian crisis of national proportions. The entire infrastructure, whether it's water, communications, or electricity, has failed. The hospital system barely worked before this crisis hit, certainly is not working now. And so while the initial body count was low, and I don't think that a body count is a proxy for what is a good disaster or a bad disaster, we shouldn't be ranking them in that manner. While the initial body count is low, the consequential losses already is in the 30s. 30 people have died so far, and many of them are dying from things that would otherwise be preventable, but for the lack of the ability to take people to functioning hospitals. The fuel supply has been crippled. So there's so many preventable illnesses that are going to really already are taking a massive toll on the most vulnerable, the elderly, people with chronic illnesses, and children. Before Maria hit Puerto Rico, there were 1 million people without electricity due to Hurricane Irma before it, 60,000 without water. That number today without water is around 50% of the island. And we should not forget that Puerto Rico is ground zero for America's municipal debt crisis, with a debt burden of around $72 billion. Think of that as a share of GDP per capita on the island. It's a debt burden that is Greek in its proportions, and there is nothing we could do about it, save for here in Washington, D.C. And so this argument of Build Back Better would be almost a moot point if we didn't also hone in on the reality that building back better requires pre-investing. And part of the pre-investment strategy, of course, is debt forgiveness and figuring out how do you lift things like the Jones Act, which I'm sure we'll talk about at length in this panel. How do you take these 1920 relic legal sort of rules like the Jones Act that not only cripple the cost of shipping, it also hamstrings the total number of vessels that could sail to Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and U.S. overseas territories at a time when we need every form of disaster relief. To be able to say it only could be a U.S.-made or U.S.-crewed vessel, it's compounding issues and adding insult to injury on the island. So all that to say, we have an opportunity here. I think this narrative of Build Back Better creates a case story where instead of our southernmost territory, the island of Puerto Rico, being a basket case that is forgotten and where 3.4 million American citizens are left to themselves and our motto of out of many we are one means nothing, we have a chance to get this right. And getting it right in the long term, I think, becomes a very compelling investment opportunity. There's an investor named John Paulson who has put his own capital, about $1.5 billion, into Puerto Rico. And he's made the reference that Puerto Rico could be the Singapore of the Caribbean. And I think that is true. We have a competitive economy. We were once the gem of the Caribbean. We have a competitive workforce that is bilingual. We have the ability to trade not only across the Caribbean, but across the United States and Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And getting Puerto Rico back to that Singapore of the Caribbean vision requires really taking this crisis and the reset button that this crisis has effectively created on the island and its infrastructure and its people, and turning it into an opportunity. And that's what this discussion at American Security Project is all about.
Cheney, over to you.
Thanks. Did you not tell me earlier your sister is there on the island?
Yes, if I can, let me give you the report. Not only, again, there's so many moving parts. So my entire family is on the island, right? Save for the ones that live with me in DC, my brother, my sister, nephews, nieces, et cetera, there. Having spoken to my sister this morning, she lives in Old San Juan, a block away from the Capitol, from the mayor's house, or the governor's mansion. And they still do not have access to clean water in the supermarkets, right? So this is, almost 3 weeks after the hurricane struck, this concept of it's okay and the body count is a proxy for, this wasn't a real catastrophe and we should be thankful, that really, really misses the mark. The situation on the ground, and this is in the Capitol, is there is no potable water coming from the taps, and there is barely any water, if at all, in the supermarkets, and that's the report from just a few moments ago.
Well, Dante, there's nothing better than on-the-ground report from somebody